Good morning, or rather good evening from New Zealand. I'm Vale, and I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague Rachel McKee on neologisms in New Zealand Sign Language related to COVID-19. New Zealand Sign Language, or NZSL, is a minority language used by the deaf community in New Zealand, and it has been an official language of New Zealand since 2006. NZSL was historically mainly used for communication in private social domains until the development of interpreting services in the 1980s, and around the same time and throughout the 1990s also acceptance of NZSL in education. And since then there's been some expansion of lexicon in a wider range of domains. Research and language documentation of NZSL also began in the mid-1980s, and that included some early lexicography. We currently have an online dictionary of NZSL, which is available both on the web and as a mobile app. There were two print dictionaries that were precursors to this. The online dictionary is mainly corpus-based, with the original data coming from video recorded, mainly spontaneous discourse, but around elicited or guided topics. The dictionary has NZSL as the source language, but it can be searched in both directions. And we know from user studies that English to NZSL is the dominant search direction. So that suggests that it's used more often as a learner's dictionary rather than being used by deaf people themselves. And it's a general purpose dictionary, although it does contain some technical terms. We currently have around 6,000 sign entries. By sign language standards, this makes it a relatively large and comprehensive dictionary, and that's due in part to the language having been used only in limited domains until fairly recently, as I mentioned before. But also, sign languages tend to have limited lexicalization, and there's a large role played by productive context-dependent forms, and I'll come back to that later in the presentation. In 2020, we also launched a new platform, which is called NZSL Share. And this is meant to be a crowdsourcing platform for sharing new and previously undocumented signs. And that also includes technical signs, for example, school curriculum-related signs. We're also hoping to use NZSL Share as an online validation tool by using the commenting and upvoting features. NZSL Share was launched in March 2020, during the first of two countrywide lockdowns. We're currently in lockdown again, unfortunately. So some of the first signs that were contributed to NZSL Share were actually COVID-19 related. And since the start of the pandemic, NZSL has also been used to provide access to government information and to public information relating to COVID. And that's led to translators and live interpreters being present both online and on television. As mediators and frontline brokers in a way of this public information, interpreters and translators have become language innovators for NZSL. And that's because they were producing COVID-related terminology ahead of community usage. And because the NZSL community was still grappling with that new information and those new concepts themselves, they could not at that point contribute very much to the creation of new terminology in NZSL. And this is why, to examine NZSL neologisms, not only did we look at the community-contributed videos on NZSL Share, but we also held focus groups with some of the translators and interpreters that were involved in these broadcasts of information, because we suspect they played a large role in coining and disseminating COVID-related vocabulary. Here are some of the terms that interpreters and translators told us were challenging in their work, and which therefore we suspect might have triggered neologisms in NZSL. We've loosely categorized these terms into three groups. First of all, as expected, there are many medical or testing-related terms. And some of these terms are quite readily understood by an English general audience, for example, vaccine or epidemic. But other terms might previously have been restricted to the medical and scientific community, so they're mostly technical terms. Secondly, there were neologisms in New Zealand English, which were either completely new or were extended or reframed concepts in relation to the pandemic. So, for example, we find words like bubble being used in a new sense, and phrases like team of 5 million. And these terms were new to both the English audience and to a deaf NZSL using audience. And then finally, there were terms that have no lexical equivalent in NZSL or that are otherwise difficult to translate. And this includes terms included in the media briefings or in public informations from areas that are not directly related to COVID-19, such as finance or government support. And so that category includes words that might not be neologisms in English. So NZSL neologisms can potentially be triggered by new concepts, but also through translation requiring new equivalents for terms that are already existing in English. When translators or interpreters need to find lexical equivalents, they typically use the same resources that languages already have for lexical innovation. So they can call on language internal mechanisms like derivation or compounding to coin new terms. Or they can draw on other languages for calques or loanwords. And different languages have different preferences for lexical innovation. So one strategy might be more frequent than another. We found that interpreters and translators in our study were very, very conscious of the strategies they used. And they indicated that they deliberately avoided coining neologisms. In the case of interpreters, this was perhaps partly because they were aware of their own identity. Many of them are second language users of NZSL. But both interpreters and translators chose to paraphrase often and to extend with examples rather than to coin new terms. So, for example, rather than using the abbreviation MIQ for managed isolation and quarantine, they used the phrase stay in a hotel. And our research participants were also concerned about language authenticity, and that caused them to use strategies such as grammatical restructuring and spatial reference to make sure that the information would be readily comprehensible by the target audience of deaf NZSL users. So also lexical extension was used. So existing signs such as this sign, which means something like spreading, were used for epidemic. As we noted before, sign languages have a relatively small established lexicon, and they frequently make use of a large set of productive forms, and these could be hand shapes or movements and locations. And those hand shapes and locations are often visually motivated, and then they are combined on the spot to depict meanings specific to the context. So, for example, this upright index finger in many sign languages is used to represent a person. And that form can then be combined with different movements in different locations to express the actions and placements of persons. So, for example, you could have someone approaching you, or you could have people meeting, or walking alongside each other, or moving away from each other. And over time, some of those productive forms become lexicalized. So the online dictionary of NZSL includes entries for signs like meet and divorce, for example. But many of those constructions don't become completely lexicalized. And we can see that those productive forms were used in relation to COVID-19 in concepts such as social distancing. Moving on then to language external strategies, we found a few calques. For example, the sign COVID positive signed with this sign. And from what interpreters and translators told us, they had concerns that a meaning such as positive would actually be understood correctly by the community from this sign. Until they saw evidence that a calque like that was used by the community themselves, they said they would prefer to use a paraphrase, like something like, someone has COVID. And sometimes the constraints of real-time interpreting and short notice translation might also have introduced calques as a default strategy. And finally, both our research participants and the wider community view online media in overseas sign languages. And from this, sometimes signs are very quickly adapted into NZSL. And the sign coronavirus is an example of a sign that was very swiftly accepted into NZSL. So to summarize, translation and interpreting of COVID-19 related terms are both driving linguistic innovation in NZSL, and it's drawing on both language internal and language external resources. And there's evidence in the texts we examined and also from our interviews that there are many translational equivalents that are new to NZSL. However, the lexical status of many of those new coinages is uncertain. First of all, many of the productive forms that I discussed earlier are not fully specified out of context. So, for example, the concept of a trans-Tasman bubble allowing quarantine-free travel between Australia and New Zealand is expressed currently by two planes flying in opposite directions. And a commonly used construction for the concept of quarantine shows a fenced-off area. But out of the immediate context of COVID-19, the specific meaning of a construction like that is not always retrievable. Secondly, some of the translational equivalents are not lexical, and instead they are conventionalized phrases or expansions. And for example, NZSL tends to express hypernyms as a list of its category members. So in the context of COVID-19, a way of signing symptoms would not be with a single coined sign, but by signing the symptoms. So if someone has a fever or sneezing or a cough, etc. But in other contexts, symptoms would be different, and so the signed phrase would also be different. And thirdly, some coinages might be idiosyncratic or very variable. Some terms evolve over time as well as more information becomes known. And translation and interpreting take place under time pressure. And there aren't very many channels or resources in place to standardize the usage of COVID-19 related terms between individuals. And both for our research participants and for ourselves as lexicographers, because NZSL doesn't have a written form, it's difficult to measure the extent to which these coinages are actually being used in the community. In conclusion then, we are planning a dictionary update towards the beginning of next year, and we plan to include COVID-19 related signs in that update. But there will be very few lexicalized terms that we can add. The most notable one will be the loan sign COVID-19 or coronavirus, because there's evidence now of widespread community usage of that sign. And there are other productive forms that are sufficiently lexicalized and consistently used and not as context dependent anymore, such as mask, that we could also add. But for the majority of signs, we will need more time to monitor emerging evidence of terms settling into a less variable form and of becoming widespread in the community. There is ongoing research on NZSL neologisms, and we will continue to include COVID-19 related terms in this research. And we're also continuing to use and promote NZSL Share. NZSL Share itself hopefully can function as a repository for such new terms at a stage where there's still variability and where they maybe are not fully lexicalized yet. But making new signs and phrases visible in one place online can contribute to consensus building around these terms without lending the signs the status that we would if we were to include them in the dictionary. And we can also use NZSL Share as an online community validation tool. So although uptake of NZSL Share is still in the very early stages, it's been really encouraging to see the different uses that people have made of the platform. And it's quite innovative, and we're hopeful that it will continue to be a bridge between the community and the dictionary. Thank you.